Imagine the world reduced to the drone of an engine and the smell of diesel fumes. For 19-year-old Sergeant James D. Rucard, this was reality in the late summer of 1944. His world was the cramped, vibrating cab of a GMC CCCKW 2.5-ton truck, his hands raw from gripping the wheel for 18 hours a day. He wasn't a frontline infantryman storming a machine gun nest, nor a pilot dueling in the skies. He was a truck driver. But in the mad dash across France, after the Normandy breakout, truck drivers were the lifeblood of the Allied war machine. Every gallon of gasoline, every crate of ammunition, every sea ration he hauled was another nail in the coffin of the Third Reich. The official name for his mission was the Red Ball Express, a relentless, nonstop river of steel and rubber flowing from the beaches to the front. The rules were simple and brutal. Maintain a speed of 25 miles per hour, keep a 60-yard interval between trucks, and never, ever stop. Not for breakdowns, not for exhaustion, and certainly not for a gut feeling. But on this particular day, somewhere on a secondary road deep in the French countryside, Rucard's gut was screaming. Something was wrong. The air was too still. The road ahead, winding through a dense forest, looked too perfect, too quiet. Orders were orders, a sacred creed in the army. But instinct was what kept a man alive. And James Rucard was about to bet his life and the lives of the 50 men in the convoy behind him on a feeling that the official maps and the confident orders from headquarters had missed something deadly hiding in the trees. The fate of an entire artillery battalion's supply of shells rested on the decision of a teenager who was technically just a delivery boy. To understand the impossible pressure on Sergeant Rucard's shoulders, you have to look back just a few weeks, to July 25, 1944. This was the day Operation Cobra was launched. After being bogged down in the dense, bloody hedgerow country of Normandy for nearly 2 months, the American First Army, under General Omar Bradley, finally ripped a hole in the German lines. Through that hole poured the mechanized fury of General George S. Patton's newly activated Third Army. What followed was not a battle. It was a blitzkrieg in reverse. Patton's tanks and motorized infantry didn't just advance. They devoured territory. They bypassed strong points, encircled entire German divisions, and raced towards Paris and the German border at a speed that stunned the world, including Allied planners. In a single day, some of Patton's columns advanced over 60 miles. The German Seventh Army, once a formidable fighting force, was shattered and then annihilated in the Falaise pocket. But this stunning success created a colossal problem, a logistical nightmare of unprecedented scale. An army, especially a fully mechanized American army, is a ravenous beast. A single armored division required over 350,000 gallons of gasoline per day to keep moving. It consumed tons of ammunition, food, and medical supplies. Before Cobra, the supply lines were short, running from the massive artificial harbors at Omaha and Utah beaches a few dozen miles to the front. Now the front was a moving target, hundreds of miles away. The French railway system, the traditional method for moving bulk supplies, had been systematically destroyed by Allied bombers and French resistance fighters to prevent the Germans from moving reinforcements. The brilliant success of the air campaign had now become a logistical anchor, dragging the advance to a halt. Patton famously screamed, "My men can eat their belts, but my tanks have got to have gas." The entire Allied offensive, the liberation of France, and the push into Germany were about to stall and die, not from German bullets, but from empty fuel tanks. The crisis demanded a radical solution, and it came on August 21, 1944. At a tense meeting of Allied logisticians, Colonel Loren Little Patton Ayers, a staff officer for the Army Services of Supply, proposed something that had never been tried on this scale. They would create a one-way, non-stop, 24-hour-a-day truck route dedicated solely to supplying the front lines. They would seize the best French highways, close them to all civilian and non-essential military traffic, and turn them into a conveyor belt of roaring engines. The operation was codenamed the Red Ball Express, a term from old railroad slang for priority freight. The plan was approved and implemented with stunning speed. On August 25th, just 4 days after the meeting, the first Red Ball convoy rolled out. The numbers behind the operation are staggering, a testament to American industrial might. At its peak, the Red Ball Express operated nearly 6,000 vehicles simultaneously. Specifically, 5,958 GMC trucks, each capable of hauling tons of supplies. The system utilized a closed loop of roads, one route heading east to the front, another returning west for more cargo, totaling over 600 miles of restricted highway. The system was manned by over 23,000 personnel, the vast majority of whom were drivers. They were tasked with delivering over 12,000 tons of supplies every single day. German military planners, when they later studied the operation, were dumbfounded. General von Manteuffel, a panzer commander, later remarked, "The astonishing thing was the supply system. It was a miracle of organization, based on the motor vehicle. This was a war of the quartermaster." What the Germans saw as a miracle was, in fact, a feat of brute force logistics, fueled by the sweat and sleepless exhaustion of thousands of men like James Rucard. Who were the men behind the wheels of this monumental undertaking? They were not elite soldiers groomed for a critical mission. The brutal irony of the Red Ball Express is that the men who formed its backbone were the very soldiers the U.S. Army deemed least suitable for combat. In 1944, the American military was still a segregated institution. African American soldiers were overwhelmingly relegated to service and supply roles, barred from most combat arms units. They were cooks, stevedores, and laborers. When the call went out for drivers to man the Red Ball, commanders scoured these service units. Men who had never driven a truck larger than a Jeep, or in some cases had never driven at all, were given a few hours of cursory instruction and thrown into the cabs of the massive 2.5-ton trucks. Approximately 75% of all Red Ball Express drivers were African American. They were men who had enlisted to fight for a country that denied them basic civil rights, a country where they were treated as second-class citizens. Now they were being asked to perform one of the most vital tasks of the entire European campaign. They faced not only the dangers of the road, but also the constant sting of racism from their own side. Yet they drove. They drove through fatigue that was so profound it caused hallucinations. They drove through rain and mud. They drove through sniper fire and ambushes from bypassed pockets of German soldiers. They drove while the Luftwaffe, in its dying gasps, would occasionally strafe the endless columns of trucks. These men, who the Army had effectively labeled as unfit to fight, were now engaged in a life-or-death battle against time, distance, and the enemy. As one driver, Sergeant Darden, recalled, "We had one job to do, take the stuff to the front line. We didn't have time to be scared." For men like Sergeant Rucard, the fight wasn't just about defeating Germany. It was about proving their worth, their courage, and their patriotism in the face of a system designed to deny them all three. The unyielding heart of the Red Ball Express was a machine, the GMC CCKW 2.5-ton 6x6 truck. To the soldiers who drove it, lived in it, and often died in it, it was simply the Jimmy or the Deuce and a Half. It was not a sophisticated piece of technology. It was loud, uncomfortable, and brutally functional. Powered by a GMC 270 cubic-inch inline-six engine, it produced a meager 91 horsepower, but its torque was immense, allowing it to haul over 5,000 pounds of cargo officially, and often twice that in practice, through mud and over cratered roads. Its top speed on a flat paved road was a theoretical 45 miles per hour, but loaded down with artillery shells or fuel cans, drivers were lucky to maintain 25. The six-wheel drive system gave it legendary off-road capability, a vital asset on the wrecked infrastructure of liberated France. Inside the cab, there were no creature comforts. The ride was bone-jarring. The engine roared directly in front of the driver with minimal insulation, and the canvas roof offered little protection from the elements. But its greatest feature was its reliability and simplicity. It was a machine that could be repaired in the field with basic tools, a crucial trait when breakdowns were constant. What truly made the Jimmy a war-winning weapon was the sheer, mind-boggling scale of its production. The United States produced over 800,000 of these trucks during the war. Over 562,000 were the specific CCKW model used on the Red Ball. This industrial avalanche was something the German High Command simply could not comprehend. In 1944, the German Army was still heavily reliant on horses, with over 1 million horses used on the Eastern Front alone. While a German supply column was a slow procession of wagons pulled by weary animals, the Allies unleashed a torrent of steel powered by gasoline. A German intelligence report from the period expressed a kind of despairing awe. The enemy's material superiority is something we can no longer overcome. For every gun we have, they have 10. For every truck, they have 100. It is not a battle, it is an avalanche. The Jimmy wasn't just a truck, it was a physical manifestation of an industrial capacity that was methodically crushing the Third Reich. A day for a Red Ball driver was a grueling marathon of endurance, a cycle that began long before dawn and ended, if it ended at all, late into the night. The routine was dictated by a relentless urgency. A driver like Sergeant Rucard would be woken in a makeshift camp, often just a field by the side of the road. There was no hot breakfast, just a cold sea ration and a canteen of coffee if he was lucky. A quick briefing would outline the day's route, destination, and the nature of the cargo. Then it was to the trucks. Pre-trip checks were supposed to be thorough, but the pressure to get moving meant they were often reduced to a quick kick of the tires and a check of the fuel and oil. Once the convoy commander gave the signal, the air would fill with the roar of hundreds of engines turning over. The rules of the road were drilled into every man. Maintain your speed. No unscheduled stops. Maintain your interval. The 60-yard gap between trucks was a crucial safety measure designed to prevent a single enemy attack from destroying multiple vehicles. But the rules were often broken by the brutal realities of the mission. Drivers, desperate to stay awake, would tailgate the truck in front of them just to follow its taillights through the darkness or thick fog. To combat overwhelming fatigue, many would dose themselves with benzodrine tablets, the go pills of the era, which only delayed the inevitable crash. The roads themselves were a constant enemy. They were choked with dust in the dry weather, turning into treacherous mudslicks in the rain. They were littered with the debris of war, burned-out vehicles, craters, and sometimes the unburied bodies of soldiers from both sides. Every mile presented a new threat. A German sniper could be hiding in any patch of woods. A bypassed machine gun team could open fire from a farmhouse. The most feared sound was the high-pitched whine of a Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf fighter diving out of the sun on a strafing run. There was no escape. A driver was a sitting duck in his unarmored cab. The only defense was the .50 caliber Browning machine gun that was often mounted on a ring above the passenger seat, a field modification that turned these supply trucks into makeshift fighting vehicles. For these men, the front line wasn't a static trench. It was every single mile of road between the coast and the ever-advancing armies they were racing to supply. Sergeant Rucard's unit, the 789th Quartermaster Truck Company, was like hundreds of others, a collection of men pushed to their physical and mental limits. On this particular day, his convoy was designated Priority 1 Alpha. Their cargo was a full loadout of M101 high-explosive shells for the 155mm long-tom artillery guns of the 90th Infantry Division. Each shell weighed nearly 100 pounds. Rucard's deuce and a half was straining under the weight of more than 5 tons of raw explosive power. The 90th Division was heavily engaged with stubborn German resistance near the Moselle River, and their guns were running low on ammunition. Without these shells, the American advance would stall, and infantrymen would die trying to take positions that could have been pulverized by artillery. The pressure was immense. Their convoy commander was a young, by-the-book second lieutenant named Harris, fresh from the States and utterly dedicated to the orders he received. To Lieutenant Harris, the mission was a mathematical equation. Distance divided by speed equals mission success. There was no variable for gut feelings. The route had been designated by headquarters. It was deemed clear of major enemy formations and was the most direct path to the 90th Division's artillery positions. Any deviation would cause delays, disrupt the tightly choreographed flow of the red ball system, and earn him the wrath of his superiors. When Rucard had tried to voice his concerns earlier, pulling alongside the lieutenant's jeep at a checkpoint, he was curtly dismissed. "Sergeant, we have our route," Harris had said, his voice tight with stress. "The road has been cleared. Now get back in your truck and maintain your interval." "We don't have time for jitters." The dismissal stung, but it was the cold certainty in the lieutenant's voice that worried Rucard more. It was the certainty of a man looking at a map, not the road. Rucard knew that maps didn't show the eerie silence or the unnatural stillness of a forest that should have been alive with the sounds of a late summer afternoon. Miles away, hidden in the dense woods bordering the road, Hauptmann, Captain Klaus Richter of the Wehrmacht, was also looking at the road, but with a hunter's eyes. Richter and his men were ghosts, the tattered remnants of a grenadier regiment that had been chewed up and spat out by the Allied war machine. They had escaped the slaughter of the Falaise pocket, but it was a hollow victory. They were a company in name only, now numbering just under 60 men. They were cut off, deep behind enemy lines, with no hope of rejoining the main German forces. Their supplies were nearly gone. They had a handful of machine guns, including 2 dreaded MG-42s, a few Panzerfaust anti-tank rockets, and their personal carabiner 98K rifles. Their ammunition was critically low. Every bullet had to count. Their stomachs were empty, and their morale was a fragile mix of desperation and die-hard fanaticism. For days they had been watching the endless river of American trucks. It was a sight that inspired both hatred and a profound sense of awe. It was as if they were not fighting a war, but moving a city, Richter would later write in a captured diary. Truck after truck, for hours, for days. We knew then that we could not win, but we could still fight. We could still kill. Richter was no fool. He knew a direct assault on a full convoy was suicide. But his scouts had found the perfect spot. It was a section of road that dipped into a shallow valley with a sharp blind curve at the entrance. The forest crowded the road on one side, providing perfect cover. On the other side was a steep wooded embankment, making it impossible for vehicles to disperse. It was a natural funnel, a perfect kill zone. His plan was simple and savage. Let the first few trucks enter the curve, then use Panzerfausts to knock out the lead and rear vehicles, trapping the rest. Then the 2 MG-42s, positioned for interlocking fields of fire, would open up and systematically shred everything in between. It was not a battle for territory. It was an act of pure destructive desperation, aimed at severing this critical artery and capturing whatever food, fuel, and ammunition they could from the wreckage. For Richter and his starving, exhausted men, this was their last chance. The ambush was a masterpiece of German fieldcraft. Hauptmann Richter had chosen his position with the cold precision of a seasoned veteran. His men had moved into the woods hours before dawn, erasing any sign of their passage. They had dug shallow foxholes, camouflaging them with branches and leaves. The 2 MG-42 machine gun nests were placed with geometric perfection. The first, nestled behind a large, moss-covered log, had a clear field of fire down the straight stretch of road leading into the curve. The second was positioned higher up the embankment, angled to pour devastating fire into the side of any vehicles that became trapped in the curve itself. This created a classic L-shaped ambush, ensuring no target could escape the intersecting streams of bullets. A young soldier armed with a Panzerfaust was hidden in a ditch just at the apex of the curve, his job to disable the lead truck and start the chaos. Another team was at the rear, ready to block the escape route. The rest of the men, riflemen with their bolt-action Kar 98Ks, were spaced out between the machine guns, tasked with picking off any American soldiers who tried to dismount and fight back. Every man knew his job. They had rehearsed it in their minds 100 times as they lay motionless, listening to the forest sounds. The wait was agonizing. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, casting dappled shadows through the canopy. The tension was a physical thing, a knot in the stomach of every soldier. A young grenadier, no older than 17, gripped his rifle so tightly his knuckles were white. He thought of his home in Bavaria, a place that now seemed as distant as the moon. For these men, the abstract concepts of fatherland and victory had boiled down to a single primal instinct: survival. They were cornered animals, and the approaching convoy was both a threat and their only hope for salvation. Then they heard it. At first it was just a faint, low hum, barely distinguishable from the buzzing of insects. But it grew steadily, a deep mechanical growl that vibrated through the soil. The convoy was coming. Hauptmann Richter put his field glasses to his eyes and whispered a single, cold command to his men. "Hold your fire until the lead truck passes the crooked oak. Let them walk deep into the trap." Inside his cab, Sergeant Rucard couldn't shake the feeling of dread. It was more than just the fatigue playing tricks on his mind. He had been on the road for weeks, and he had developed a sixth sense for the rhythm of the French countryside. And this rhythm was all wrong. The first sign was the birds. Usually, the roar of the convoy would send flocks of birds scattering from the trees. Here, there was only silence. It was as if the birds already knew something was wrong and had fled. Then he noticed the road itself. It was too clean. There were no civilians, no children waving, no farmers on rickety carts. On every other road, there had been a steady trickle of refugees returning to their liberated villages. This stretch was utterly deserted. It felt sterile, unnatural. He strained his eyes, scanning the dense wall of trees that lined the right side of the road. He saw a flicker of movement, or thought he did. Was it just the wind in the leaves? Then he saw it, something definite. A single, freshly broken branch on an otherwise healthy oak tree about 50 yards ahead, right at the start of the sharp curve. The break was bright, new wood, not the gray of an old storm-felled limb. It was too low to have been hit by a truck. It was at the perfect height for a man to have pushed it aside to clear a line of sight. It was a tiny detail, something 99 out of 100 drivers would have missed. But for Rucard, it was a blaring alarm bell. His heart hammered against his ribs. He grabbed the handset for his truck's radio, his voice cracking with urgency. "Lead 1, this is Convoy 6. I see something. Something isn't right up here. The woods, they're too quiet. I think we need to halt." The reply from Lieutenant Harris was instantaneous and laced with angry static. "Negative, Convoy 6. I have my orders, and so do you. You will maintain speed and proceed. Do you copy? Proceed." Rucard looked at the broken branch again, then at the dark, silent maw of the curve ahead. The lieutenant's order was an echo from a world of maps and headquarters. Out here, in the real world, a different set of rules applied. Why was Lieutenant Harris so unyieldingly rigid? To him, a single convoy stopping without reason wasn't just a minor delay, it was a threat to the entire strategic operation. The Red Ball Express was not a series of independent convoys. It was a single, massive, interconnected machine. Planners at COM-Z, Communication Zone, headquarters, had choreographed the movement of thousands of trucks with the precision of a ballet. Each convoy had a designated time slot on a specific route. A delay in one convoy could create a traffic jam that stretched for miles, backing up dozens of other convoys carrying everything from blood plasma to tank engines. This logistical cascade could have devastating consequences. The artillery unit waiting for Rucard's shells wasn't just sitting idle. They were providing crucial fire support for an infantry assault. If those shells arrived 2 hours late, the assault might fail, costing dozens of American lives. This was the immense pressure that rested on the shoulders of every commander, from the generals in their chateaus down to a young lieutenant on a dusty French road. Furthermore, the designated routes had been chosen after careful intelligence analysis. Aerial reconnaissance photos were studied, and reports from French resistance and Allied cavalry scouts were collated to identify the safest and most efficient paths. On paper, the road Rucard was on was green. To deviate from that plan based on the jitters of a teenage sergeant seemed to Harris like an unforgivable breach of discipline and a dereliction of his duty. He was a product of an officer training system that emphasized chain of command and absolute obedience to orders. His career, and more importantly, the success of the mission as he understood it, depended on following the plan. In his mind, the greatest danger was not a hypothetical ambush, but the very real chaos that would result from a breakdown in the clockwork precision of the Red Ball Express. He was making the logical choice, the one dictated by his training and the overwhelming strategic context. It was also the wrong choice. In the woods, the German soldiers held their breath. The sound of the engines was deafening now. The lead vehicle, a jeep carrying Lieutenant Harris, was just entering the kill zone. Behind it, the first of the massive GMC trucks lumbered into view. The young German with the Panzerfaust slowly raised the crude metal tube to his shoulder, his eye aligning with the simple sight. He could see the faces of the Americans in the jeep, their helmets, the casual way the man in the passenger seat was holding his rifle. They looked relaxed, unaware. The air grew thick with unspoken tension. Hauptmann Richter watched through his binoculars, his finger hovering over the flare pistol that would signal the start of the attack. Every instinct screamed at him to give the order, but he held back, adhering to his own strict discipline. His plan depended on trapping as much of the convoy as possible. He needed the first few trucks to get deeper into the curve before he sealed the trap. He focused on the crooked oak tree, his designated marker. He watched the jeep pass it. Then the first truck, then the second. The third truck, Sergeant Rucard's truck, was approaching the marker. Richter allowed himself a flicker of grim satisfaction. The Americans were fools. Their arrogance, their reliance on maps and schedules, had led them like lambs to the slaughter. In a few seconds, he would unleash hell, and this quiet stretch of road would become a scrapyard of burning metal and dead men. He felt the familiar surge of adrenaline, the cold clarity that came before combat. For his men, this was more than an ambush. It was a moment of revenge for comrades lost in Normandy, for cities turned to rubble by Allied bombers. It was a final defiant roar against the overwhelming tide that was drowning their world. The convoy was now perfectly positioned. Richter's hand tightened on the flare gun. The moment had come. The order from Lieutenant Harris was clear. Proceed. The voice in Sergeant Rucard's head screamed, "Stop!" For a heart-stopping second, he was torn between the training of a soldier and the instinct of a survivor. Then he saw it. Not a flicker this time, but a definite metallic glint from the wooded embankment high above the road. The sun, for a brief instant, had reflected off something: a pair of binoculars, a rifle scope, a steel helmet. It was all the proof he needed. In that split second, Rucard made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He wasn't just a driver anymore. He was the protector of the 50 men behind him. He ignored the screaming voice of the lieutenant in his radio headset. He stomped on the brake pedal with all his might. The truck's air brakes hissed violently, and the 10 massive tires locked up, screeching in protest against the pavement. The 5 tons of artillery shells in the back shifted with a sickening thud. The massive deuce-and-a-half slewed sideways, blocking both lanes of the narrow road. Behind him, chaos erupted. The driver of the 4th truck, caught by surprise, swerved violently to avoid a collision, his vehicle jackknifing and coming to a stop just inches from Rucard's tailgate. Horns blared. Men shouted in confusion and anger. Over the radio, Lieutenant Harris was incandescent with fury. "Convoy 6, what in God's name are you doing? I will have you court-martialed for this, Sergeant. Move that vehicle now." But Rucard wasn't listening. He was already kicking open his door, grabbing the M1 carbine clipped to the inside of the cab. He yelled to his co-driver, "Get on the 50, now!" As he jumped to the ground, using the massive engine block of his truck for cover, he knew he had crossed a line. He had disobeyed a direct order in a potential combat zone. But as he looked towards the silent, menacing woods, he also knew he had just saved them all. Hauptmann Richter saw the 3rd truck screech to a halt, blocking the road. He swore under his breath. The trap had been sprung prematurely. They had been spotted. The element of surprise, his greatest weapon, was gone. There was no more time for tactics or finesse. He fired his flare gun. A single red star shot into the sky, and before it even began to fall, the forest exploded with noise and violence. The world was ripped apart by the sound of an MG-42 opening fire. Firing at over 1,200 rounds per minute, its sound was not the rhythmic thumping of other machine guns, but a terrifying, continuous ripping sound, like a giant canvas being torn in two. Soldiers called it Hitler's buzzsaw. The first stream of 7.92mm tracer rounds slammed into Lieutenant Harris's Jeep. The vehicle's thin metal skin offered no resistance. The windshield shattered into 1,000 pieces. The lieutenant and his driver were killed instantly, their bodies thrown back like broken dolls. The machine gun then traversed to the first truck in the line. The driver, a young private from Ohio, died before he even knew what was happening. The truck, its engine block and tires shredded, coasted to a stop. From the other side of the road, the second MG-42 opened up, its fire raking the length of the convoy. Bullets hammered against steel doors and canvas tops with a deafening staccato rhythm. Men screamed. The air was filled with the zip and crack of passing rounds, the ping of ricochets, and the smell of cordite. The German riflemen added their fire to the maelstrom, their shots methodical and precise, picking off drivers who were desperately trying to scramble out of their cabs. In less than 10 seconds, the head of the American convoy had been transformed from an orderly procession into a scene of carnage and chaos. For the Germans, the initial shock of being discovered was replaced by the ferocious adrenaline of the firefight. They had lost the perfect trap, but now it was a simple, brutal contest of firepower. In the heart of the chaos, while other men were frozen by shock or diving for cover, Sergeant Rucard moved with a strange, cold clarity. The deafening roar of the battle seemed to fade into the background. His actions were swift and deliberate. He didn't run. He didn't hide. He fought back. Using his massive truck as a solid piece of cover, he raised his M1 carbine and began firing measured shots into the woods, aiming for the muzzle flashes of the German rifles. He wasn't just shooting wildly, he was trying to suppress the enemy, to make them keep their heads down. Above him, in the ring mount, his co-driver, a corporal named Henderson, swung the massive bulk of the Browning M2 50 caliber machine gun towards the most immediate threat, the MG-42 nest that was chewing up the front of the convoy. Henderson thumbed the butterfly trigger, and the M2 answered with its own terrifying voice. The sound was not a rip, but a deep, hammering roar, thump, 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 that shook the entire truck. Each 50 caliber round was the size of a man's finger, a small explosive shell that tore through the forest. It didn't just hit branches, it obliterated them. Trees that stood in the way of its fire were literally sawed in half. The effect on the German machine gun nest was devastating. The log they were using for cover disintegrated into a shower of splinters. The gunner and his assistant were killed in a bloody instant. Seeing Rucard and Henderson fighting back broke the spell of panic that had gripped the other drivers. Men began to organize. Using their own trucks as fortifications, they returned fire with their carbines and rifles. Other 50 calibers began to open up, their heavy rounds stitching lines of destruction across the German positions. The ambush had turned into a full-blown firefight, and Sergeant James D. Rucard, the 19-year-old driver who had disobeyed a direct order, had just become the de facto commander of a desperate defense. The firefight raged, a brutal contest of firepower fought at point-blank range. The American drivers, though not trained infantry, had one overwhelming advantage: the Browning M2 .50 caliber machine gun. Mounted on at least one in every 5 trucks, the Madus was a weapon that inspired absolute terror. A German soldier could survive a hit from a carbine. A hit from a 50 caliber round simply erased him. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical. German veterans of the Eastern Front, men who had faced the endless hordes of the Red Army, wrote after the war about their specific fear of the M2. One captured officer stated, "We could handle your infantry and your tanks, but it was the 50 caliber that broke our morale. There is no defense against it. It goes through walls, through engines, through men. To be caught in its fire is to know that you are already dead." Rucard's convoy now had at least 10 of these weapons firing into the German positions. The forest, which had been the Germans' advantage, now became a death trap. The heavy rounds ripped through the trees, showering the German soldiers with lethal wood splinters and shrapnel. The second MG-42 nest, which had been pouring fire from the embankment, was silenced when a sustained burst from an M2 caused the earth around it to simply collapse, burying the gun and its crew. Hauptmann Richter watched in horror as his perfectly planned ambush disintegrated. His men were pinned down, unable to move. The sheer volume and power of the American return fire was something he had never witnessed. They had expected to be shooting at panicked drivers in unarmored trucks. Instead, they were facing a dozen mobile fortresses, each armed with a weapon that could chew through their cover as if it were paper. The Panzerfaust teams, crucial for stopping the trucks, were unable to get a clear shot without being cut down by the torrent of 50 caliber rounds. The hunters had become the hunted. The German attack faltered, then broke. Faced with the overwhelming, shredding firepower of the Browning machine guns and the determined resistance of the drivers, their will to fight evaporated. Hauptmann Richter, seeing his force being systematically annihilated, gave the only order that made sense: retreat. The surviving German soldiers, grabbing their wounded, melted back into the deep woods from which they had come, leaving behind their dead and their 2 silenced MG-42s. The roar of battle was replaced by an eerie silence, broken only by the crackling of flames from the lead truck, the groans of wounded men, and the ticking of cooling engines. The immediate aftermath was a scene of controlled chaos. Sergeant Rucard, his carbine still clutched in his hands, moved from truck to truck, organizing the defense and directing aid to the wounded. The air was thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder, burning rubber, and diesel fuel. The lead 2 trucks and the lieutenant's jeep were destroyed, blackened husks leaking fluid onto the road. 4 American drivers were dead, including the 2 men in the lead truck. Another 7 were wounded, some seriously. But the bulk of the convoy, over 50 trucks carrying hundreds of tons of vital supplies, was intact. The men, their faces grimy with sweat and dirt, looked at Rucard with a mixture of awe and respect. The anger from his decision to stop was gone, replaced by the certain knowledge that he had saved their lives. The convoy's new, unofficial chain of command was clear. There was no need for a vote or a discussion. The 19-year-old sergeant who had trusted his gut over his orders was now in charge. He began issuing commands, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Get the wounded consolidated over here. 2 trucks to form a roadblock at the rear. Everyone else, check your vehicles and your ammo. We're not out of this yet." There was no time to mourn the dead or fully tend to the wounded. The mission was still paramount. Rucard knew the 155 mm guns of the 90th Division were waiting for their shells. He organized the survivors with grim efficiency. The crews of the destroyed trucks were reassigned to other vehicles. The most seriously wounded were made as comfortable as possible in the back of a canvas-topped truck that would now serve as a makeshift ambulance. The burning wreckage of the lead vehicles was a problem. It completely blocked the road. Using 2 of the powerful GMC trucks, Rucard and his men attached tow chains, and with engines roaring and tires screaming, they physically dragged the smoldering hulks into the ditch, clearing a path just wide enough for the rest of the convoy to pass. Within an hour of the ambush ending, the convoy was moving again. It was a battered, bloodied procession, but it was moving. They drove with a heightened sense of awareness, every driver scanning the woods, a rifle or carbine resting on the seat beside them. They limped into the 90th Division's artillery position just as the sun was setting. The artillery commander, a grizzled major, ran out to meet them, his face etched with relief. "We were down to our last 20 rounds per gun," he exclaimed. "We were about to call off the morning's attack. You have no idea how glad we are to see you." As the drivers, weary to their bones, began the arduous task of unloading the heavy shells, the major looked at the bullet holes riddling the trucks and the grim faces of the men. He knew they had been through hell. Within 12 hours, the shells delivered by Rucard's convoy were screaming over German lines, blasting a path for the American infantry. A key enemy strongpoint was obliterated, the attack succeeded, and dozens, perhaps hundreds of American lives were saved. The direct line from a teenage sergeant's gut feeling to a victory on the battlefield had been drawn in fire and steel. The official report of the incident presented a serious dilemma. On one hand, Sergeant James D. Rucard had flagrantly disobeyed a direct order from a superior officer, an act that, under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, could lead to a court-martial and a long prison sentence. His actions had resulted in the convoy halting and, in a sense, initiating the engagement. On the other hand, every surviving member of the convoy, from privates to the senior NCOs, gave sworn testimony that Rucard's actions had undoubtedly saved the convoy from complete annihilation. The acting convoy commander, a staff sergeant who took over after Lieutenant Harris was killed, wrote in his after-action report, "Sergeant Marr, Rucard's decision to halt the convoy while in violation of a direct order was based on a correct assessment of an imminent enemy threat. His subsequent actions in organizing the defense were exemplary and directly responsible for repelling the enemy attack and preserving the convoy's mission-critical cargo. Had the convoy proceeded as ordered, it would have driven fully into the kill zone, resulting in the loss of all vehicles, cargo, and personnel." The report went up the chain of command, landing on the desk of a colonel in the services of supply. He was a pragmatist who understood the realities of the war, far from the spit and polish of the parade ground. He was faced with a choice: punish a clear act of insubordination to maintain discipline, or reward an act of courage that produced results. In the end, the logic of the situation was undeniable. The Army valued results above all else. The charges were quietly dropped. 2 months later, in a simple ceremony, Sergeant James D. Rucard was awarded the Bronze Star Medal for heroic or meritorious achievement or service. The citation made no mention of his disobedience. Instead, it praised his quick thinking, courage, and leadership under fire. It was a quiet acknowledgment that sometimes the most important orders are the ones that come from within. Rucard's story, while dramatic, was just one small event in the colossal saga of the Red Ball Express. To grasp the true scale of the operation, one must look at the final mind-numbing statistics. The Red Ball Express ran officially for 82 days, from August 25th to November 16th, 1944. It was shut down only when the port of Antwerp was finally cleared and open to Allied shipping, and the French railway system was sufficiently repaired to take over the bulk of the logistical load. During those 82 days, the men and trucks of the Red Ball delivered a staggering 412,193 tons of supplies to the front lines. The daily average tonnage delivered was over 5,000 tons, with a peak day reaching nearly 12,000 tons. This cargo included 62,475,000 gallons of gasoline, enough to fill the tanks of every car in the state of Ohio at the time. It included millions of artillery shells, hundreds of millions of small arms rounds, and countless tons of food, medical supplies, and engineering equipment. The trucks themselves clocked a combined total of over 1.5 million miles per day. By the end of the operation, the total distance driven was equivalent to circling the globe multiple times. These are not just numbers. They are the mathematical formula for victory in a modern mechanized war. Without this constant high-volume flow of supplies, the Allied armies would have ground to a halt in the fall of 1944, giving the German army precious time to regroup, rearm, and fortify the West Wall, potentially prolonging the war by months and costing tens of thousands more lives. The staggering success of the Red Ball Express came at a high human cost. The operation was a relentless meat grinder, not just from enemy action, but from the sheer physical and mechanical strain. Driver fatigue was the single biggest enemy. Men drove for 18, 20, even 36 hours straight, fueled by caffeine and amphetamines until they literally fell asleep at the wheel. Accidents were horrifyingly common. Trucks would veer off the road, overturn, or crash into each other in the dark. A driver falling asleep while hauling a tanker full of high-octane gasoline was a death sentence for himself and anyone near him. Mechanical failure was another constant threat. The GMC trucks were reliable, but they were not invincible. They were run without maintenance, their engines pushed to the breaking point day after day. A blown tire at high speed could send a 5-ton truck cartwheeling into a ditch. A broken axle would leave a driver stranded, a vulnerable target for German snipers or roving patrols. The official casualty figures for the Red Ball Express are difficult to isolate, as they were often folded into the general numbers for the communication zone. But the danger was real. The roads to the front were not secure rear areas. They were a no-man's land where bypassed German units, like the one that ambushed Rucard's convoy, operated with deadly intent. Luftwaffe strafing attacks, though becoming rarer, were still a threat. The men of the Red Ball Express were awarded very few medals and received little glory, but their casualty rate, from accidents, exhaustion, and enemy fire, was comparable to that of some combat units. As one driver grimly put it, "They gave us a truck and a rifle and told us to drive. The only difference between us and the infantry was that our foxhole had wheels." From the other side of the hill, the German High Command watched the Red Ball Express with a mixture of professional admiration and utter despair. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the German supreme commander in the West, was a brilliant old-school Prussian officer who understood logistics better than most. He knew that an army's reach was limited by its supply chain. His own forces were being systematically starved. A German panzer division in late 1944 was lucky if it was at 50% of its authorized fuel and ammunition. Many units were forced to abandon their tanks and fight as infantry simply because they had no gasoline. In his post-war interrogations, von Rundstedt repeatedly came back to the topic of Allied logistics. "Our primary problem was supply, and the enemy's was not," he stated flatly. To see the endless columns of trucks, day and night, it was demoralizing. We could win a battle, destroy an American division, but we could not stop the trucks. They would simply bring up a new division, fully equipped, the next day. We were fighting a force that could not be exhausted. This sentiment was echoed throughout the German command. They had been raised in a military culture that prized tactics, fighting spirit, and operational brilliance. Now they were being crushed by an enemy who had turned warfare into an industrial process. The Red Ball Express was the ultimate symbol of this new reality. It wasn't about a brilliant flanking maneuver. It was about overwhelming the enemy with a sheer mass of material. A German soldier fighting with a 5-round clip in his rifle was facing an enemy supplied by a system that delivered 40 billion rounds of small arms ammunition during the war. It was a war of factories and logistics, and German generals knew with a sickening certainty that they had already lost. The legacy of the Red Ball Express extends far beyond the battlefields of Europe. For the thousands of African American soldiers who drove its trucks, the experience was transformative. In an army and a nation that had systematically denied them opportunity and questioned their courage, they had been handed one of the most critical missions of the war, and they had succeeded beyond all expectations. They had proven under the most arduous conditions that they were the equal of any soldier, of any color. This fact was not lost on the men themselves, nor on the military leadership. While the Red Ball Express did not immediately end segregation in the Army, it became a powerful, undeniable piece of evidence in the argument for desegregation. Men like Sergeant Rucard returned home not as second-class citizens in their own minds, but as men who had stared down the enemy, who had held the fate of armies in their hands, and who had delivered. They became part of a generation of black veterans who would form the vanguard of the civil rights movement. Their service gave them the standing, the organizational skills, and the unshakable conviction to demand the rights they had fought for abroad. President Harry S. Truman, himself a World War I veteran, was aware of the stellar performance of segregated units like the Red Ball Drivers and the Tuskegee Airmen. When he signed Executive Order 9981 in 1948, officially desegregating the United States Armed Forces, he was not just making a moral statement. He was acknowledging a practical reality that had been proven in the mud and blood of France. Segregation was not only unjust, it was militarily inefficient. The roar of the engines on the roads to Bastogne and Berlin had become an engine for social change back home. In the end, victory in World War II was not the product of a single battle or a single brilliant general. It was a victory of systems, of industry, and of ordinary people asked to do extraordinary things. The story of the Red Ball Express is the story of the entire Allied effort in miniature. It was a story of immense power, of brutal efficiency, and of the unheralded courage of men who were largely invisible to the history books. Men like Sergeant James D. Rucard were not super soldiers. They were teenagers and young men pulled from service units who found themselves in the nerve center of the war. Their courage was not the explosive bravery of a frontal assault, but the grinding, relentless courage of endurance. It was the courage to keep driving when your body screamed for sleep, to push a failing engine for one more mile, and to face the fear of a sniper's bullet or a hidden ambush around the next bend in the road. They were the forgotten heroes of the liberation of Europe, the tanks of Patton's Third Army, the guns of the First Army, the rifles of every GI on the front line, they were all powered and supplied by this river of steel. The Red Ball Express was the artery that kept the heart of the Allied advance pumping, and its lifeblood was the grit, determination, and quiet heroism of thousands of ordinary men who, for 82 critical days, put the outcome of the war on their shoulders and drove it all the way to victory. How a 19-year-old broke the rules of a war machine to save it from annihilation